On the morning of February 3, 2012, thousands of passengers across dozens of airports worldwide woke up to discover their flights simply didn't exist anymore. Not delayed, not canceled and rebooked, gone, along with the 66-year-old airline that was supposed to be operating it. Planes sat grounded on tarmacs from Budapest to London to Tel Aviv, their crews suddenly out of work, their passengers stranded with tickets that were now, quite literally, worthless pieces of paper. Picture a passenger at Budapest's airport that morning, luggage already checked, boarding pass already printed, only to be told at the gate that the airline itself no longer exists. There's no rebooking counter to visit, no alternate flight on the same carrier to catch instead, because the carrier itself has simply ceased to be a functioning legal entity overnight. Airport staff, themselves suddenly unemployed, try to help stranded travelers figure out how to get home on whatever other airline happens to have available seats, at whatever price the sudden surge in demand now commands. This wasn't a sudden market collapse, the kind we've documented across nearly every other company in this series, where an Eastern Bloc business met open competition and lost within 18 brutal months of 1989 or 1990. This airline had already survived that moment, and the decade after it, and the decade after that. It had modernized its fleet, joined the European Union alongside its home country, and kept flying for more than 20 years after nearly every other company we've profiled in this series had already been dismantled, sold off, or transformed beyond recognition. And then it was killed anyway. Not by a collapsing customer, not by a rival's takeover, not by internal boardroom warfare. It was killed by a ruling from Brussels, by the very rules of the international club its home country had joined specifically to secure its future. This is the story of Malév, Hungary's national airline, the only company in this entire series that didn't die in the chaotic scramble of the early 1990s, but survived for 2 full decades into the 21st century, only to be finally, definitively grounded by the fine print of the European Union's own competition law. To understand how an airline can outlive nearly every other Eastern Bloc industrial giant we've covered in this series, only to be killed by legal paperwork rather than market forces, we need to go back to the earliest days of post-war Hungarian aviation. In 1946, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, Hungary established its first post-war commercial airline through a joint venture with the Soviet Union, a company known as Malev, an arrangement that gave Moscow direct partial ownership and influence over Hungary's fledgling aviation industry from the very beginning. Consider what this joint ownership structure actually meant in practical daily terms for Hungarian aviation workers in these earliest post-war years. Unlike a purely nationalized domestic enterprise, Malev operated with genuine Soviet personnel embedded directly in its management structure, Soviet aircraft and technical standards shaping its daily operations from the very beginning, and Soviet strategic interests, rather than purely Hungarian national priorities, often taking precedence in decisions about routes, equipment, and investment. This wasn't simply Hungary building its own airline under communist ideology. It was, quite literally, a jointly Soviet-controlled enterprise operating on Hungarian soil, a distinction that mattered enormously to the Hungarian aviation workers and officials who spent years pushing for the eventual transition to full national ownership. This kind of joint Soviet satellite ownership structure wasn't unique to Hungary. Similar arrangements existed across several countries newly falling under Soviet influence in the immediate post-war years, a deliberate mechanism through which Moscow maintained direct strategic control over emerging infrastructure in its new sphere of influence, well before the more formalized Comecon specialization system we've discussed regarding other companies in this series had even been fully established. By 1954, Hungary had renegotiated this arrangement, taking full national ownership of its own airline, which was renamed Malév, an abbreviation of its Hungarian name meaning Hungarian Air Transport Company. Under this new, fully Hungarian-owned structure, Malév developed into the country's national flag carrier for the remainder of the Cold War, operating Soviet-manufactured aircraft, much like Interflug's own fleet we documented in a previous episode, connecting Budapest to other Eastern Bloc capitals as a matter of basic necessity, while also maintaining a modest but genuine network of international routes beyond the Iron Curtain. Here's where Malev's story begins to genuinely diverge from Interflug's, though, and where this particular episode earns its place as a distinctive addition to this series rather than simply a repeat of a story we've already told. When communism collapsed in 1989 and 1990, Hungary's own transition followed the more gradual, market-oriented path we've already discussed regarding Skoda's story, the same goulash communism head start that had given Hungary's economy considerably more experience with limited market mechanisms than its neighbors. This gave Malév a genuinely different survival trajectory than Interflug's abrupt 18-month collapse. It's worth pausing on just how different these two national airlines' starting conditions genuinely were, despite following remarkably similar early Cold War trajectories. Interflug's entire existence had been tied to a country, East Germany, that was about to cease existing entirely, its government, its currency, and its diplomatic status all disappearing in the exact same moment its airline lost its primary competitive advantage. Malév, by contrast, remained the flag carrier of a continuously sovereign Hungarian state throughout this entire period. Hungary didn't dissolve or merge into a larger neighbor the way East Germany did. It simply transitioned, gradually, from one economic system to another, while remaining the same continuous political entity Malév had always served. This single structural difference gave Malév decades of runway that Interflug never had any realistic access to. Rather than facing instant, total exposure to a reunified national aviation market, the way Interflug did when East and West Germany merged overnight, Malév operated as the aviation flag carrier of a continuously independent Hungarian state throughout the entire post-communist transition, giving it considerably more time and considerably more government support to attempt a genuine modernization. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Malév gradually replaced its aging Soviet-built aircraft with modern Western jets, including Boeing 737s, bringing its fleet up to genuinely competitive international standards in a way Interflug's Soviet fleet, grounded within 18 months of reunification, never had the opportunity to achieve. Picture the genuine significance of this fleet transition for ordinary Hungarian air travelers during these years. Passengers who had spent decades flying on Soviet-built Tupolevs and Ilyushins now found themselves boarding genuinely modern Western aircraft, with all the improvements in comfort, safety, and reliability that came with them, under the exact same Malév livery and national identity they had always associated with Hungarian air travel. This wasn't Interflug's story, where the entire underlying identity and infrastructure collapsed within months of reunification. This was a genuine, gradual modernization, allowing Hungary's national airline to continue serving its passengers under continuous Hungarian ownership while steadily catching up to Western aviation standards. Exactly the kind of transition none of the other national carriers we've profiled in this series ever managed to achieve on anything like the same extended timeline. But this longer survival came at a genuinely significant cost, one that would eventually catch up with the airline in a way none of the other companies in this series quite experienced. Malev's finances remained chronically fragile throughout this entire extended period, propped up repeatedly by Hungarian government subsidies and bailouts across successive administrations, each one treating the airline's continued survival as a matter of genuine national pride and practical necessity, Hungary's only direct connection to the rest of the world's aviation network under its own national flag. Consider the genuine political logic driving this repeated pattern of rescue, one worth understanding rather than simply dismissing as poor financial management. For successive Hungarian governments across the 1990s and 2000s, allowing the national flag carrier to fail entirely represented a genuinely painful political and symbolic defeat, an admission that Hungary couldn't sustain the kind of national aviation presence that most of its Western European neighbors took for granted. Each successive bailout was, in a real sense, a bet that the next round of restructuring, the next change in management, or the next modernization effort would finally put the airline on genuinely sustainable footing, a bet that, time after time, didn't quite pay off, yet never seemed bad enough in the moment to justify simply letting the airline collapse instead. At one point during the 2000s, a Russian state-linked investment group took a significant ownership stake in Malév, part of a broader pattern of Russian capital flowing into former Eastern Bloc industries during this period, before eventually selling that stake back to the Hungarian state a few years later amid ongoing financial difficulties. Yet another restructuring in a long, exhausting sequence of ownership changes and rescue packages that kept the airline limping forward without ever fully resolving its underlying financial fragility. And then, in 2004, Hungary joined the European Union, an achievement that represented, in many ways, the ultimate validation of the entire post-communist transition this series has documented across 10 previous companies. Formal membership in exactly the kind of prosperous, rules-based Western economic club that Solidarity's shipyard workers, Skoda's negotiators, and countless other figures across this series had been implicitly working toward the entire time. But EU membership came with a genuinely consequential catch, one that would eventually prove fatal for Malév specifically. The European Union maintains strict rules governing state aid to individual companies, designed specifically to prevent member governments from propping up favored national businesses with taxpayer subsidies in ways that would distort fair competition across the EU's shared internal market. It's worth understanding why these particular rules exist, because they reflect a genuinely important principle underlying the entire European single market project. If one member state could freely subsidize its own national airline, manufacturer, or bank without limit, that company would gain an unfair advantage over competitors based in other member states operating without similar government support, undermining the entire premise of a level, competitive playing field across the Union. These rules aren't arbitrary bureaucratic overreach. They're a foundational mechanism ensuring that EU membership actually delivers genuine competitive markets rather than simply replacing one country's protected national champions with different countries' protected national champions. Every single bailout, every subsidized loan, every government rescue package Hungary had extended to Malév over the preceding 2 decades now fell under retroactive scrutiny from European competition regulators in Brussels, who began investigating whether this pattern of repeated state support had violated the very rules Hungary had agreed to uphold upon joining the Union. In 2012, after years of investigation, the European Commission ruled definitively that Hungary's accumulated support for Malév constituted illegal state aid, ordering the airline to repay a substantial sum to the Hungarian government, an amount the airline, already operating on razor-thin margins after decades of financial fragility, simply had no realistic way to produce. Consider the genuinely narrow set of options this ruling left Hungarian officials with. The government could not simply provide yet another rescue package to cover the repayment, because doing so would itself constitute another instance of the exact same illegal state aid the ruling had just condemned, potentially triggering further penalties and deepening Hungary's legal exposure within the EU system. Nor could Malév realistically raise this sum through its own ordinary commercial operations, given how thin its margins had remained throughout its entire post-communist existence. The ruling had, in effect, closed off every single path that had kept the airline alive for the previous 2 decades, all at once, with essentially no transition period in which to find some alternative solution. Facing this ruling, and with the Hungarian government now legally barred from providing any further rescue support without risking additional EU penalties, Malev's management had no remaining options. On February 3, 2012, the airline ceased all operations immediately, grounding its entire fleet without warning, ending 66 years of continuous Hungarian national aviation history in the space of a single morning. There's a genuinely unique irony embedded in this particular ending, one worth sitting with directly, because it distinguishes Malév from every other company we've profiled across this entire series. Every other collapse we've documented was, in some fundamental sense, a story about exposure to open market competition, whether through a vanished customer, a rival's takeover, internal conflict, or a factory's ground being claimed by a competitor. Malév wasn't killed by market competition in any direct sense. It was killed by successfully joining the very rules-based international system its country had spent 2 decades working to become part of, only to discover that the specific mechanism keeping it alive throughout that transition, ongoing government support, was itself precisely the kind of practice that system explicitly prohibited. In the aftermath of Malev's collapse, Budapest's airport, suddenly without a national flag carrier calling it home for the first time in 66 years, was rapidly filled by a wave of low-cost European carriers, particularly budget airlines that expanded their Budapest route networks almost immediately to absorb the demand Malev's sudden disappearance had left behind. This transition happened with a speed that genuinely surprised many observers at the time. Within weeks of Malev's collapse, budget carriers had announced dramatic expansions of their existing Budapest operations, adding new routes and additional frequencies specifically to capture the passenger demand the defunct national carrier had left completely unserved. This rapid response reflects something genuinely important about how thoroughly European aviation markets had already been transformed by liberalization over the preceding 2 decades, well before Malev's own specific collapse. The infrastructure, the regulatory framework, and the competitive appetite for exactly this kind of rapid market entry were all already firmly in place across the EU's single aviation market, ready to absorb the sudden gap the moment it appeared. For ordinary Hungarian travelers, air travel to and from Budapest didn't become meaningfully harder to access. It simply stopped being provided under a Hungarian flag, replaced by exactly the kind of pan-European market-driven aviation competition the EU's own rules were specifically designed to encourage. So here's where this particular story lands, and here's what makes it meaningfully distinct from every other story we've told across this entire series. The Trabant was killed by freedom. Icarus was killed by a distant superpower's collapse. Tatra nearly killed itself through internal conflict. Wartburg's factory ground was claimed by its ideological rival. Zeiss Jena was reunited with its estranged half. Robotron chased an unwinnable technological race. Skoda chose to surrender its independence and thrived because of it. Interflug was defeated twice by the same rival, decades apart. CKD Praha was fragmented by the very privatization process meant to save it. The Gdansk shipyard's own workers caused the collapse of communism itself, only to watch their own workplace struggle in the market economy they had fought to create. Malev's story adds something genuinely distinct to this list, a company that actually survived the initial collapse everyone else in this series succumbed to, that modernized, that endured for 2 full decades into a genuinely new economic and political era, only to be killed, in the end, not by the raw shock of market exposure, but by the accumulated legal consequences of exactly the kind of prolonged, well-intentioned government support that had allowed it to survive that initial shock in the first place. There's a genuinely important broader lesson buried in this particular ending, one worth naming directly before we close this story out. Joining a prosperous, rules-based international system, whether the European Union or any comparable arrangement, isn't simply a matter of gaining access to new markets and new opportunities. It also means accepting genuine constraints on how a government can support its own domestic companies, constraints that can, years later, catch up with exactly the kind of institution that system was supposedly designed to help. Hungary joined the EU seeking prosperity and stability. It got both, in a broad sense, but the specific mechanism that had kept its national airline alive throughout the difficult transition years turned out to be fundamentally incompatible with the very system it had worked so hard to join. It's a genuinely different kind of ending than anything else in this series. A slow-motion collapse spanning more than 20 years, concluded not in a moment of dramatic market failure, but in a single morning's compliance with a legal ruling from a supranational institution that didn't even exist in its current form when this entire story began back in 1946. 11 industrial and commercial giants now, all built somewhere behind the same broad iron curtain, and 11 genuinely different endings. This one a reminder that even successfully surviving the fall of communism and successfully joining the prosperous Western order that followed it carries no permanent guarantee of survival. If the very support that got you through the transition eventually becomes, under the new system's own rules, the very thing that ends you. Let us know in the comments which Iron Curtain industrial giant you want us to dig into next, and subscribe, because there are plenty more of these stories still waiting to be told.